Distinguished participants, colleagues, and our partners here at AAAG, we're happy to have you join us for this important webinar. It is 14:30 or 2:30 Central African time, if you like, and we're happy to say good afternoon from Zambia. I don't know where you are joining us from, whether it's good morning, good evening, from across our beautiful continent and the world at large. We know we have a couple of participants from different parts of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants and AGs that may be joining us on this platform, on behalf of the African Association of Accountants General, it is my honor to welcome you to this very timely and important webinar titled Rebuilding Trust in Public Finance, Accountability as Africa's Growth Accelerator. Now, why is this webinar title important? We convened at a defining moment for our public financial management in Africa. And you're all aware we face quite a number of challenges across our countries. Firstly, there is rising expectations on our governments to provide more services while resources keep diminishing. We're living in a space where financial resources are diminishing, donor support is diminishing, so the physical space has shrunk. Therefore, it is important that we convene and discuss a certain aspect relating to this, especially that citizens are now demanding not just trust but result, particularly in the advent of social media. So at the same time, a deepening trust deficit then continues to pose a challenge on the credibility of our institution. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, this is simply not just a governance issue. It is a development issue that directly affects our countries, our economies, our continent's ability to deliver services, attract investment, and sustain inclusive growth. Now, the beauty is that in today's conversation, we invite ourselves to shift our perspective. Is accountability just about compliance, I ask? No, it is also about performance, and I want to add that. It is about ensuring that every public resources that is mobilized on our continent translates into tangible outcomes for our citizens. It is about embedding integrity, financial discipline, or fiscal discipline, if you like, and the transparency across the entire public financial management cycle. Ladies and gentlemen, on this conversation, we are privileged to be joined by thought leaders who have walked this journey. Firstly, we'll have Professor Tiruven, who will join us. He's a research and lead expert at Aston University. Professor Tiruven has been working with us at AAAG on a number of projects. We just concluded a research on how best we can reposition the Office of the Accountant General to be able to be an advisor, a strategic role within the PFM circle. So through the insights that we are going to share, your active participation, which I invite you to indulge on, we aim that we move beyond diagnosis, but we move towards finding solutions, and not just solutions, but practical solutions and system-wide approaches that will restore a confidence in public resources, in how we manage our public resources, and ultimately, how do we strengthen the social contracts between government and citizens? This is very important. As we approach this session, I'm inviting you, ladies and gentlemen, that this is not just a mere dialogue, but a call to action. One that challenges us that as custodians of public finance, we need to lead the transformation from compliancy to impact, and from reform to results. That way, our citizens across Africa who are demanding more results, who are demanding more services, and unfortunately, amidst a dwindling resource envelope. I want to thank you all for taking your time to be here with us, and we look forward to a very enriching and engaging conversation. And I must say, earlier on, we had sent out the invite. We're expecting the Accountant General of Tanzania, possibly. He may or he may not join us. He's right now, as you're aware, the role of the Accountant General is very important. He was called to Parliament to go and make a submission, but possibly at the end of, we're hoping that he manages to join us. We send out that information that he'll be part of this conversation, but he may or he may not join us. But we still have Prof. Tiroven to help us drive this conversation, as we will be joining later, if God willing, by the AG from Tanzania. Allow me now to bring in Tiroven, but before he comes in, let me just introduce Prof. Tiroven, a friend of AAAG, one of our experts who is helping us to drive and champion PFM reform at AAAG. Professor Tiroven is a professor of accounting at Aston Business School. His research addresses the role of accounting, accountability, governance, and notably in a global South context. Some of his recurring topics relate to corporate environment, social and governance disclosure practices, the implementation of corporate governance codes, accounting regulations, professionalization projects, and the implication of public financial management reforms. From an engagement and policy perspective, he has co-authored several reports, including some funded by the African Professionalization Initiative, API if you like, the World Bank's Public Expenditure Financial Accountability Office, and the UK Financial Reporting Council. In particular, he also co-wrote the PEFA report, examining the extent to which public financial management systems support fiscal transparency and accountability in developing countries through an analysis of outcomes of the PFM systems and case studies of African and Asian countries. In addition, a Prof co-authored the API report analyzing public sector accounting and auditing capacity in selected African countries. Through his continued involvement with the African Accounting and Finance Association, he is the research convener of the Africa Call for Accounting and Public Finance Research Initiative funded by the Pan-African Federation of Accountants. Prof currently serves as a PFM researcher for ourselves, as I indicated, at AAAG. He further details can be found at the website on Aston University. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants, kindly allow me now at this juncture to bring in Professor Tiroven to share his insights on this topic. Prof. Tiroven, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Thank you very much, AAAG. Can you hear me?
Yes,
just make sure you can hear me. Excellent. I'm very pleased to be invited, and I'm very pleased for the invitation to present. And I appreciate the introduction and obviously the work that's already been ongoing with the AAAG on this on the general topic of PFM, but there's so many angles that actually we're working on. I'm hoping that you can see my slides. I'm hoping someone can confirm that the slides are visible. Yeah, thank you very much, and I can then move on. As Bruce has set the scene for this, and I believe we're still waiting if the Accountant General will join afterwards. So obviously I'm taking a much more sort of researcher angle to this. But as Bruce has mentioned, it's more around things for thinking about in terms of the broader discussion about today's topic, which is more about the trust. So I think that the key word but I've taken to start off really and make the link and for reflection and thinking through this idea of rebuilding trust. No other priorities taking more and more in the world around building public trust in public in particular, right? Public trust, so trust in the public institutions, public organizations, obviously, including public and accounting institutions such as accountant generals, but also any other sort of institutions tasked with managing the finances within a country. We are living in very, very difficult times, very, very challenging times, as you may know, you may realize, and this is occupying the minds of many, many development agencies, researchers. So I'm hoping only to present a snapshot, really, of what's going on, or what we know, what can help us progress along the pathway. Bruce has made the point about beyond compliance. Okay, so compliance was really a big issue when it comes to accounting, when it comes to public finance, when it comes to PFM. But now I think we are also starting to think beyond compliance, not because compliance has been solved, not necessarily that in a way compliance is being resolved. It's still there are challenges with them, but because we need to look at compliance, we need to look at PFM beyond that narrow idea of compliance, because it needs to make sense to the people that we are actually trying to, that you are trying to help. As members, public accountants, public sector accountants, or working in the AAAG offices. So I wanted to, given that there's this idea of trust, so I wanted to really this is something we shouldn't take for granted. These concepts, accountability, trust, they're not necessarily, or we may have a certain taken for granted idea of what trust is, and where do we sit in there as institutions, as public sector accountants, as members of the accountant general officers. We may have an idea of what we mean by trust, but I think it's important, and actually it made me even rethink a little bit what was going to talk about. And then we'll bring some sort of research ideas around what is the role of trust. Has it been found to have some impact? So why is that important? And in particular, the trust deficit. The brief was also to raise a little bit the discussion around value for money audits, not because there are also a number of other practices that are happening within the PFM space, but that was one of what was picked up. And then basically, where do we see audit and accountability mechanisms that we are very familiar with? How does it aim towards really trust and public sector performance? Okay, and what does it mean for the AAAG as we go forward? Okay, so that's what I'm trying to highlight today. I really would like people to sort of try to take forward some key messages from this, and I will mention other projects that I'm doing at the moment. Obviously, as Bruce has mentioned, this is a project with Aston University. Aston University is a partner with AAAG. We already did a project together, as Bruce has mentioned. It's going to come out soon, hopefully. We're also developing other ideas. We're trying to find basically, and this is a call to all accountant general officers, this is an attempt to kind of develop research projects that are impactful, research projects that will have a clear impact on the ground, not research for the sake of research. I think even researchers have moved on from that, not research for the sake of just writing a paper and publishing it, but rather research that can be actually put into practice. And you will find out later that I talked about the lack of research, really, in for example, in the accountant general offices. Right, so we are increasingly, the starting point is really this concern. I mean, although my slides are talking about Africa, we can really transpose it to every single economic, every single context, really. We are focusing on a tight fiscal space, rising public expectations, increased scrutiny of public resource management. Everywhere, money is tight, demands are increasing. So these two things are, diametrically going to create tensions And trust is part of that, so can people really understand that their taxes, their contributions to the public purse are actually going to the right item of expenditure? Is it generating the right amount of outcome? So, no, I mean, there's been a lot of concern across the world about this. So then that brings this idea of trust. Okay, what do we mean by trust? What do we mean trust in the public sector or in public sector accounting? You can apply it to any sort of context. And what was interesting is I went back and looked at this idea of public trust and what we mean by trust. And our trust may mean simply, we trust each other. We believe in the actions of the other. We believe that actions will be put into place. But one of the things that we always say is accounting as a practice has evolved as a result of a lack of trust. Because we don't trust necessarily things to happen in an informal sense, we require formal systems to strengthen the capacity and the confidence of people to invest, to give money, to comply with rules, and so on. So trust in the public sector is vital, because that's what in a sense influences people into believing that, okay, I can willingly give my money, I will willingly give my resources because I know the government will do something about it. All right. So that link, that bond is quite crucial in everything we do. We believe in when the government says something, when you as accountant general speak out, or the political leaders speak out, there's a belief that this is happening behind the scenes. Okay. So the first thing that we talk of trust, we talk of fiduciary trust. And that's the one that probably you are most familiar and we are all familiar with, the idea of fiduciary trust. Okay. So in other words, there's a sort of contractual expectation as agents of government, as agents of institutions. We are having a role assigned to her as an accountant general, has a role assigned in the constitution in a way to operate, to manage public finances on behalf of the government, on behalf of the people. Okay. Now, what it means is that one thing is underlying that is that there's a lot of asymmetry of relationship, right? So in other words, I give money to the state, but I don't see what is happening behind, right? So that's the idea. I don't see what is going on. I can only see my money leaving my pay packet, but I don't see where else is going on. So the idea of accounting and accountability is to try to maintain that fiduciary trust through various forms of reporting, through various forms of accountability, but reinforce fiduciary trust, right? That reinforce that, I know where my money is going, or I can see from the presentation of financial statements, the budget statements, the accounts, the auditor general reports, the accountant general reports, everything that is being produced is about addressing that fiduciary trust. Okay, so that's what I think we're all familiar with. And when there is an unfortunate situation, when there is scandals, when there is corruption, when there is irregularities, which means there is a breach of that trust, that fiduciary trust. So, you were expected as an agent of government to do this. Whether the agent is a politician or whether the agent is an accountant, it's the same sort of expectation. You were supposed to make those requirements, but you did not do that. Okay, so this is a breach of fiduciary trust. However, and this is the important bit, we may have given a lot of attention to this idea of fiduciary trust when we are thinking about trust as accountants. But what the public understands at trust, or what individuals, what citizens, what groups of people who are looking outside, they don't necessarily just see trust in this way. And this is the important bit for today, really, for people to remember. But I don't just trust something, an institution, based on fiduciary relationship. I also develop what I call a mutual trust. All right. I develop a mutual trust. In other words, as we interact, as citizens interact individually with an accountant, with a person at the accountant general office, with a public sector accountant, as they develop an individual in relationship, they interact with each other on a daily basis, they develop what we call mutual trust, right? So this is another element of it. Okay, so if I can use an example, we are dealing officially with AAAG. I'm an academic at the Aston University. So we have certain relationships set up through a document, a memorandum of understanding, and that is the fiduciary trust we are developing. At the same time, I have met Bruce. Bruce has met me. I've met Frederick. I've met the mayor's members. We've met in Ghana last year, and we've developed what we call mutual trust. In other words, through the individual interactions, we develop a sort of trust of what the other can do, what the other one will do, and that we'll trust this will happen. Okay, so you understand that understanding public trust in accounting is not purely about fiduciary trust. It is also through the exercise of mutual trust. And finally, the last bit of trust is social trust. Okay, so in the fact that when people look at institutions like Accountant General, we hope that it is taken for granted that the Accountant General Office is a trustworthy institution by its very setup process and the way it operates. Okay, so for Accountant General to have an impact on public trust, to really influence public trust fully and coherently, it's not just about fiduciary trust. And I think that is where the challenge is, because we have been relying too much and sometimes, exclusively on improving mechanisms for fiduciary trust, but ignoring the other elements of mutual and social trust. Okay, that may sound a little bit academic, but what I'm trying to say is that we need to think of trust in a much broader way. And then can we then see our role, the role of public accountants, the role of public sector accounting. I hope this, I'm going to move on, but I hope this kind of reaches out to you in terms of how we see this. Of course, there's been lots of work, lots of research. I'm not going to go into detail, but clearly that notion of public trust then feeds into everything. How people comply with tax, how people accept policy, how people believe in the institution. When an institution says this is what is happening, they believe in that. Okay. Unfortunately, as I've put at the bottom here, there's a number of fragile situations, and this situation is not only an African story. We are living in the midst of a conflict, as you know, and that issue of trust is everywhere. It's not just about Africa, but because the presentation is about Africa, so I've focused on it, but it applies everywhere. So corruption, leakages, difficulty to understand the link between spending and outcomes, right? Explain to anyone in the street, okay, this money is going for this, and the perception from the people, but remember, it's perceived perception. Perception is that, well, I don't see it. I don't see my hospital getting better. I don't see my police department, my police coming faster to deal with a complaint. I don't see the schools where my children are going improving the quality of materials for improving the education outcomes. I don't see it. Therefore, if I don't see it, then therefore public trust kind of affects that. Okay. There's a classic anecdote yesterday that the UK government is going through, this idea of trying to tell people, we are trying to put, we know the cost of living is very hard. We're trying to put money into people's pocket. We're trying to do this expression is used quite a lot, put money into people's pockets. But the reality is that the more you put money in people's pockets, the more they realize the money is very small to what else is happening around it. So they're not really focusing on, for example, as I said, the quality of delivery of services. They're trying to treat the individual, the citizen, as a sort of, I will refer to that later on, as a sort of shareholder or as a sort of customer, right? Okay, if you're not happy as a customer, okay, I'll give you some money and I'll make you happy. But when it comes to the relationship between the state and its people, I think it's beyond that of a customer, right? So it's not that we want necessarily more money in our pocket, but we want better services, and we can't see it, and that's where the situation is. There's limited visibility of accountability actions, even when they are very, we'll see that very elaborate systems of accountability. We are implementing IPSAS, we are developing new accountability reports, auditor general reports, accountant general reports, value for money audits. We engage into a lot of actions for the sake of accountability, but the reality is that this is very visible to most people. So I go back to my earlier point. It might tick the box of fiduciary trust. Yeah. So fiduciary trust is being developed because you're putting out more of those documents and reports to improve your fiduciary responsibility, to show your responsibilities as a fiduciary, as in charge of fiduciary resources. But you're not developing mutual trust. You're not developing necessarily social trust. Okay, and that is where the challenge is. I just wanted to highlight very quickly this notion of erosion of trust, right? That Intosai has written recently about this. Only 50% of the world's population express trust in their organizations, in their governments. 41% in government leaders, 62%. So you can see here that we are starting from a very difficult position, that when we are communicating reports and information, half, on average, of course, doesn't mean it's the same everywhere else, but on average, half of the people are looking at these reports and saying, I don't necessarily believe in them. If I ever read them, I don't necessarily think they are comforting me, they're giving me confidence about the use of resources. And that is a big challenge. This is not a challenge that only concerns accountants, of course. It concerns public sector managers, politicians, parliaments. It's not just you, but it means it's an important aspect. So let's go back to this idea of trust again. Mainstream PFM reforms, and I don't think I'm saying anything controversial here, mainstream PFM reforms, that the ones that you are been implementing for many years, and I don't go into the detail of those reforms because that was a presentation I did last time in Ghana. Mainstream PFM reforms have tended to emphasize the need to improve fiduciary trust. Okay, that is what is always been the case. Fiduciary trust is what we're trying to action upon, and mainly from one angle, or a very few angles. For example, the citizen is a taxpayer. So the relationship of trust that we're trying to develop is with a taxpayer as an individual, or the customer, right? So the new public management has kind of presented to the public sector that the idea of dealing with citizens is to treat them as customers. But then again, as I say, as a customer, your relationship yourself. If you go to a shop, if you go to buy something online or whatever, what is the relationship you've got? It's a fiduciary relationship again. You don't necessarily develop mutual and social trust with your local shop, right? So if you position the citizen or the people or the community merely as a customer, there is only so much you can do in terms of developing trust. Okay. So yes, you may trust the product is in the correct order, this product is safe, but it doesn't develop more than that. Okay. And finally, the other point I want to make is this idea of improved citizen trust. The idea that the reforms have not really led to improve citizen trust or perceived government performance. Accounts are being prepared, financial statements are being prepared. This is okay, absolutely fine. These reforms are improving the quality of the reduction in irregularities, the improvement in the flow of resources, budget deficits, budget variations. All these measures that we know in the PEFA framework, for example. But if you're familiar with the PEFA framework, that's all happening. So we're not challenging that. Accountant generals are not aiming towards that or not achieving towards that. What we're thinking is that how does that lead to trust? And that's where there's a broader problem. Because the moment, in a sense, and this is unfair perhaps, the moment that you've done all of this and then there's a corruption scandal or something comes up, a case comes up and takes over everything else, it then sort of drags down reputation and trust, generally speaking. People keep thinking, well, nothing's changed, it's the same, nothing's changed, it's the same, and so on and so forth. And really concerns. So I think when we are talking about developing better PFM, we're trying to, not better PFM, but rather when we're trying to engage with PFM reforms, when we're trying to develop PFM reforms, we're trying to need to think of these multiple conceptions of trust, right? How can we do that? Contributing both to to fiduciary, to mutual, and social trust. Okay, so that's the challenge when we are talking about doing this. I hope that's okay. I'm going to move on from this idea of trust and everything, but I hope that reaches out to you, and then keeps a reflection in your mind as to, okay, I need to improve fiduciary trust. That's okay, but how can I also improve mutual and social trust? What do we need to do as OAGs, as members of OAGs? What do we need to do in relation to that? Okay. And obviously, as we do this, this is where it becomes effective, enforceable, and visible to citizens. That's where things become more visible to citizens. They do not become more visible to citizens if we just keep doing what we've been doing, albeit better and better, but it's not necessarily having that visibility as well. This matter is becoming increasingly concerned across the world because the lack of trust leads to what we call, and this is other projects I'm doing on what we call democratic backsliding. So in other words, what is happening is as the trust drops around public trust in the government drops out, then basically generally it starts to lead to what we call people being upset about the current situation. This is what the notion of democratic backsliding means, that sometimes people lose faith in democratic systems, and then you get into movement into what we call authoritarian style governments and so on and so forth, which is again what you can observe in many contexts, is as people lose trust in the system, where else do they look, or what other perceived solutions do they think would be better played in their view? So I have no doubt that I believe in a system that would obviously, a democratic system that would obviously take into account the will of the people and the will of elected people as well, and then how this is applied in practice. But this is the danger lurking in the background. And I'm doing a project on the idea of local government accountability. How do we make local government accountability better so that we don't have this backsliding, this democratic challenge of democratic principles, which in many African countries, as you know, has taken decades to try to build up, to strengthen. And you as members of Office of Accountant General, you're part of that process of contributing to a democratic reinforcement of many of these countries, whether you can see directly or not, but it does have an impact. And then what we're having now is a very, very difficult time, the way you put it. And so there's many literature and in economics, in finance, and I don't intend to go into all the details about this, but really there's a lot of work about trust and the driver of fiscal capacity. So there's a lot of economic type studies, obviously, that would obviously say, well, the more you develop trust within the institutions, the more you improve the public's interest, the more they comply with tax. The more they engage with tax compliance, and the more they engage with more mobilization. And trust, also supports redistribution and reforms. It encourages the idea of redistribution of resources, and also trust tends to the way by which a trust in an accountancy, in accountability, what it means is that it encourages people to join formal economic activity and reduce informal economic activity. As you know, in Africa, a large part of the economic activity is informal, right? Small businesses and so on and so forth. A large part of that remains informal, stays informal, and remains informal because, again, with the element of trust, doesn't incentivize people to think I should join the formal system, pay taxes, and so on and so forth. Okay, and so these elements are well proven in the literature that we need to develop this level of trust as a lever for fiscal capacity. The second thing, as I said, is accountability as a credibility mechanism. So accountability. So what you do, what you prepare, what you operate within your respective departments. You help obviously signal integrity in the use of public funds, competence in delivering services, fairness in resource allocation. You're here to do that. You have to demonstrate that the accountability demonstrate how the resources are done, approved, following a process. Democratically elected. That's why we voted budget, and so on and so forth. Okay, but not all accountability mechanisms are equal, right? So we may have a range of ways by which we deliver an accountability, but not all of them deliver in the same way. So soft accountability, information disclosure, just giving a lot of information. And PFM reforms have a lot of the time emphasized that, more information, publish more information, more transparency, make it more visible, right? But what happens is nothing else follows from that, okay? Right? Nothing else follows from that. So we may get lengthier and lengthier Auditor General reports. We may be more accounting statements prepared on IPSAS, more detailed budgets, yes, but there's nothing else after that. Okay, so we call that soft accountability. And then on the other side, you have hard accountability. So in other words, when this information comes out, it also triggers answerability, right? What we call answerability. Accountability is obviously more central around the ability to answer for your actions. Okay, so the numbers have come out. Someone, an institution, a structure, or whatever, will ask, well, why did this happen? How did you manage to spend this, overspend, or whatever the case may be? And although there's been many attempts at bringing hard accountability, think PFM Act, think examples in various countries, charge and surcharge, all these sort of attempts to try to bring answerability, it didn't necessarily yet move a dial. We're still, I think, probably this is an unfair comment. I mean, it's a general comment. It doesn't mean that certain countries have kind of pushed towards more of a hard accountability. Others have still stayed at the back, focusing on soft accountability. Okay, so let me move on again. So yeah, clearly, new public governance that you may have come across has then started to understand all of this. What is the impact of compliance? It's probably limited. So let's start looking at performance accountability. So again, this is another sort of area that has been looked at, whether we can see the outcomes. But again, it hasn't been that easy to define, to understand what we mean by outcomes. The moment we use the word outcomes, I can tell you many accountants, many managers, in a sense, in a slightly funny way, run for the hills, because we can understand outputs. We can understand intermediate outcomes, maybe a little bit of outputs, but outcomes, improving the quality of education, improving the services at the health in a hospital. There's a lot more thinking needed to see how does accountability, how does accounting lead to these particular outcomes. How do we see it? There was recently a PEFA call for funding for consultancy. I don't think we tried to put something, but I don't think we were going to be successful. But the point is more, they were trying to understand the chain, the causal chains. What is the causal chain between the PEFA reform, the report that was written to improve PFM in your country, and then how does it then lead to improvement in public services? Okay, so even PEFA in 2026 right? So this is important, an important point, and this is something to be welcomed at the global level. Even PEFA is now trying to think, it's how do we get our how do we justify, how do we motivate the need for PFM reforms? How do we make PFM reforms very important so that we can see what outcome does it lead to? There's been some studies, of course, I've talked about them in my previous presentation, some studies about whether, for example, better PFM scores at the PEFA level improves health outcomes. And there's been some studies finding some relationship that as your PFM scoring according to PEFA goes up, your performance on certain health outcomes, according to WHO, does improve. Okay, so we statistically we see some kind of connection between these two things. But however, how, where does this happen in the middle? What's a black box? We don't know enough of that. And so, this is quite important. And it's important for Africa because our resources are limited, development needs are high, and citizens are becoming increasingly, I'm sure you've heard this statistic, more than 50% of African citizens are under 30, a young population, asking for question, putting up questions, asking for demand, asking for results. So you can imagine, in a way, if we just say here's a report, maybe we'll not get the outcome we want from them. They want certainly to have an understanding of where we need to do things better. Okay, so let me move on from this. And what we know certainly is the deficit in trust. All right, so we know certainly that corruption, leakages, and perceptions of misuse clearly affect this trust. Clearly the reason why you may spend 1,000 projects very well and done a very good job at it, and you can demonstrate, and then one project happens to have been tainted significantly with corruption and other sort of irregularities and leakages, and that is enough to actually balance out back, the perception and the trust into this. It's again an unfair point, for you, as I agree, it's an unfair point. Why does one? But it's how fragile the notion of trust is, especially if we're just relying on fiduciary trust. If we have social and mutual trust together, then perhaps one case might be seen by most people as maybe an accident. And then they can say, oh, that's great, I think can happen. But if people have only relying on fiduciary trust and something like this happened, then you think, well, if the systems were supposed to work, if the accountability systems are supposed to work 100% of the time, how come this happened, right? So this is a question again for us to think about, that this reliance on accountability systems that rely on accounting systems, standards, and all of this is very vulnerable to concerns that you're not doing things systematically then. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a problem of this nature. Taking exception of materiality concerns and all of this. Second thing is the disconnect between spending and outcome. So I think we've done that. As I said, this is a structural problem. And I think this is where more research will be certainly needed. And number one is this idea of asymmetry and limited visibility. So the fiduciary trust, in a way, by doing more accounting, better standards, learning about IPSAS, developing the competencies, is you're obviously trying to address that asymmetry. However, there is an assumption somehow that citizens understand all this information, right? Can see corrective actions, can see how public funds are being used. Okay, so this is where the information asymmetry, so the taxpayers cannot see what's going on behind the walls, and they still, even though we are giving them accounts, they still can't understand exactly, do I have enough understanding of where my money is being used? Okay, now I move on away. I talk a little bit about VFM. I'm happy to continue. Bruce, am I okay with time? I'm assuming. Please do signal if I have to go faster or not. I'm going to continue, but Bruce?
All is well, Stephen. All is well.
Always well. Okay, thank you. So then we focus a little bit on VFM now, because I think VFM is a long-standing practice. It's been around for a long time in developed in sort of Western countries and so on and so forth, and then applied in many contexts. So we can see there's certainly a lot of value into value for money audits. And research has been finding that VFM audits can improve program efficiency, strengthen measurement accountability, and support policy learning. So that's clear. But where the problem is, VFM by its very definition is a sort of narrow idea. Okay, do we have evidence of value for money? But then what do we do next about it? Okay, what's the strategy for the next step? What's the change in policy we expect? That is less obvious. Okay, so you may have a VFM report and it reveals various things, but then it kind of stays there rather than being used in a more holistic way. A recent study, I just looked at that recent study. In the UK says and the UK is the land of VFM reports. They do a lot of VFM studies, and they don't see enough information and understanding how the frees are associated with the VFM assessment. So it is done, but then what do we take out of it has been subject to some criticisms. So this is another important, and this is one of my students has just started to look at this in the sense of how do we take forward the audit findings to actually do something about it. So audit findings are produced but not consistently implemented. I'm sure you're familiar, again, in the case of more generally with the Auditor General reports. There's a lot of Auditor General reports. So a lot of Auditor General reports, lots of reading to do, but then the follow-up. Although, again, countries have started to improve the capacity for monitoring these audit findings and how they are being implemented. But sometimes, as I said, enforcement mechanisms are weak and political incentives may not support reform. So because the report may reveal deficiencies that affect, not only the accountants, but also the politicians. And politicians themselves are not feeling necessarily keen to say, yeah, we did wrong. That shouldn't have happened, because they don't want to take necessarily a full responsibility for what may have happened. So then that breeds a situation where the reports are kicked down the can. We kick the can down the road until eventually we'll look into this. And I think when the AAAG did its own gap analysis, it identified this particular issue. So VFM audits have potential. Again, this is another example of an accountability system that is good, but is inherently a very good technical ability. However, the problem is, how does it improve trust? How does it build trust? It can only build trust if we can see the visible consequences of it, if we can explain to the citizenry, to the people, how are we going to do something about it? Okay, everyone accepts things have not been very efficient or effective or economical, but what else are you going to do about it? Otherwise, in about 2 years' time, we see another VFM report coming in and saying same thing. And that's where you can see how damaging is it to trust. Right now, we lose trust in the fiduciary systems. We lose trust in mutually. We lose trust in a sort of social, in the institution itself. Now, the VFM audit was prepared by institution X. Now, the second time this happens, now you start not looking at the VFM report. Now you start thinking that the institution itself has a trust problem. You start having a confidence issue about the institution itself. So this is where, in a way, perhaps people or perceptions about the institution become damaged as a result of what we are noticing. I'm going to move on a bit because I think this is much more general around the law of control systems, and I think that is what I think I wanted to mention this. But I think again, these are still, remember, technical aspects of accountability systems, so internal controls. But I think that, again, as we are improving with digitalization, we're improving with the use of technology, we're improving with the use of systems. I think that's something we expect to be as a baseline operating. But again, it's quite difficult to explain to the citizen out there when a fraud happens, and then you say, well, all processes, all internal controls were operating, right? It's quite difficult. It's such a paradox to go back and say, well, our processes were correct, but yet um, it's like the funny story, but I'm sure, well, not so funny story, but the anecdote of the doctors coming out of a surgery saying operation was successful, but the patient has passed away. So yeah, processes was correct, but the outcome is not good. So that's quite difficult if you imagine the citizen from that side. So which means more and more, I think, and this is where I think maybe in Africa, this is still perhaps in development, or we're trying to do that. This is much more happening in a sort of European context in particular. US perhaps first initially, but now much more in a European context is this idea of making things as open as possible, getting citizen engagement, making citizens becoming more understanding of information. So yeah, transparency initiatives to make citizens, for example, the communication of procurement data. So you now have any procurement over £25,000 needs to be public. You know, everyone can read it. I was reading recently around Finland. Finland is one of the rare countries where everything literally is available. The salary of your neighbor can be obtained. Information about your neighbor's salary, information about the salary of anyone can be public information. So this notion of transparency is absolute in these sort of examples. But this requires still that the citizens can understand the information. There are mechanisms for engagement. So even if we understand, even if a citizen, step one, the citizens understands the information, can they then do something about it? Can they raise a concern about it? And then that the institutions also respond to that. Okay, so there's a sort of loop required here for the transparency to have any impact. So if I say there is a procurement database of all procurement over $25,000, a citizen uses that information, questions a particular procurement. So there's a way for the person to go back and say, well, I've noticed this. Can you explain this? Then someone as an institution responds back. That's what we mean by having a citizen-centric accountability, right? So in a sense, that's what is often, and that is a big issue. We use the word transparency, but we often mean transparency only in the first level. In other words, we just put the information out. What you do with it, what can you get something out of it, or can you get engagement out of it? That doesn't happen. And again, on this level, I have to admit, it's not purely an African kind of argument. It's across the world. The notion of transparency is always around just giving me information. So publishing budgets or publishing financial statements is one thing, but it is not enough. Clearly, it must be able to be accessible, relevant, actionable. People should be able to raise questions, genuine questions. I'm not saying sort of spurious criticisms or but actually constructive debate about it. Right. So bringing that back to the accountant general, I think, because I'm sort of getting to the end of this now, and so I wanted to start with this idea of trust quite centrally. How accountability systems, as we know it, as we tend to use it, is much more around fiduciary trust. Okay, and therefore, to what extent can we push the dial of fiduciary trust? To what extent can we keep playing on fiduciary trust to improve a general level of trust in public finances? And as you can see, as you can guess, my sort of analysis about this is not sufficient. This is important, this is crucial, but this is not sufficient, especially to reinforce deeply the level of trust that people should have in the public finances. This is probably one of the most important thing in your life as an individual. You know, you give money to the bank, so you trust the bank will keep your money. Every day you can check, and you can check, and you will understand that the money is there. You can give money to your family. You know your family is using the money for whatever reason because you trust they are using it for what they've said they've done it. But you give your money to government, right? So as a contrast, you give money to government. What happens? What's happened to it? How is it contributing to? Is it contributing in the right way? If it has been wrongly used, do I get to know about it? So in a sense, that is the notion of trust we're trying to develop. Now, when it comes to then, this ties up a little bit to my, this is from my, this is a brief kind of coverage of what I talked about in November at the conference about the strategic role of the accountant general as a foresight organization, right? Not a hindsight organization, the foresight organization. And I sort of went through this, but I wanted to highlight this because in a way, I had highlighted the various elements of does it mean to be a strategic accountant general office? What does it mean to be a foresight organization? And I provided some examples here, or not some key dimensions, be able to develop strategy, to be politically astute, that's one angle, to be able to develop confidence as an organization. This is about the organization, to be agile, to be ethically focused, to find ways to motivate, retain, develop OAG staff so that they feel that they are contributing to not just balancing the books in a way, but beyond that. Okay. Stakeholder oriented. So this is the link here between, if you want, this idea of trust and stakeholder. How do we develop an engagement with the community that we develop that level of trust, which is fiduciary, social, and mutual. Develop that relationship with them. There has been examples of how do we communicate accounting reports in a different way, a summary way, something that is easier for people to understand and understand what is the Office of Accountant General, what is it trying to do, and what it has achieved in a few pages, not in 400 pages, but in a few pages. How can we do that? So that's, I think, is one of the really important element of the link between trust and stakeholder oriented. So, and then the last part, of course, is obviously you've got to do the things that you're supposed to do organizationally, operationally, and so on and so forth. And also this idea of, understanding more your societal impact. How does an AAAG can claim to a societal impact? Can we? I remember at the conference, it wasn't me, but I remember, I think it was someone talking about when an accountant is signing, or in the story that he had anyway, he was saying, well, if accountants are delaying or for some reason they're delaying the payments, that's like 5 operations in the hospital that are not being done. Okay, when there is some issue at the accountant general, that's like 10 classes of students who don't get a teacher. So he was trying to find ways to make it a reality on the ground of your task and your activities within, so societal impact in a sense. So really thinking way beyond the technicality of it and the fiduciary duty of it, and then applying it in improving the level of trust at all levels. So that's what I think I wanted to highlight and just remind yourself on this. Now, what does it mean? I mean, as a researcher, I will conclude on this and obviously hopefully allow for some debate to come out of this, for some debate, and I obviously would like really your views and ideas, and I'm sure the AAAG is also interested about this, because one of the things that we've been doing and is scoping out research ideas, policy relevant research, right? Important for me to say policy important research, not research because simply we want to do it. No, it is research that has policy importance. Okay. So for example, we know from the review I had to do for this presentation that there are very few studies about looking at trust and accountability. How does trust in Africa develop, right? So we are here to try to improve trust in public finance, but we don't really understand how that is happening. Yeah. So we can only, so that, as I said at the beginning, we had to reconceptualize what do we mean by trust? As in trust in the public, the public trust, the people, if they want to have trust in us, how do they come to that conclusion? Okay, so I think we don't understand that. How do we know, firstly, what is the level of trust that people have in the OAG? That could be an important question by itself. How do we know people know about the OAG, trust the OAG, and see the institutions in what light? Okay, that could be an important baseline study in a sense. You could do a baseline of understanding how your accountant general office or the work and the task of the accountant generals are seen from outside. Because if we don't, we shouldn't make assumptions. We should obviously try to have a baseline of what is happening now. Remember, I started with a statistic from Intosai: 50% of the general population doesn't trust the government. So you can see that there's nothing we can take for granted here. There's a weak evidence on the causal impact of VFM audits. So one thing would have been good to do as a study is to take some of these VFM audits to actually see how this is put into practice and what are we changing as a result of that. Limited understanding of citizen perceptions of audit outputs, right? So we are preparing audit reports or accountant reports. Let's say think of SAIs. There's preparing reports. There's limited understanding of how people perceive them, how they use it, and so on and so forth. And finally, perhaps I think one thing that I've been talking about already in the previous presentation, the previous talk I did, was the link between PFM and OAG efforts towards outcomes. So as Office of Accountant Generals, you've been at the center, very often at the center of major accounting reforms, major PFM reforms. And I know you've had to deal with many of those and taking time to embed all of those. But now the question is, how does that now lead to outcomes? What are the causal relationships really? And that's something we don't know, we know very little of. And that would reinforce the public trust if we were able to communicate more clearly what outcomes in terms of education, health, public services, development, local development, how do we see that happening? So in conclusion here, clearly accountability is a growth accelerator, there's no doubt. Accountability is part of that message. I don't think we are going to have an argument about this, but I was talking more about what types of accountability, how does this accountability gets to the people, right? How does this accountability really change trust, right? That's not clear. And here in this case, accountability needs to be credible, needs to be performance oriented, needs to be people emphasized and enforced, right? So if people see irregularities, leakages, corruption issues arising, nothing happens out of it, no action is taken, no visible action is taken, then the next perception will be, well, yeah, everyone is in for together, everyone is doing this. This is, unfair characterization starts. People are perceived to be, all of you people are just taking the money and not doing anything for us. That's where the democratic backsliding starts. That's why I was trying to highlight this earlier. So for African public finance systems to move a dial on trust, right? So fiduciary trust and relationally. So by relationally, I mean the notion of mutual trust and the notion of social trust. We have to move to outcomes. We have to be able to demonstrate outcomes much more. We have to strengthen this chain of accountability, right? So this is happening. The VFM report has happened. The audit report has happened. The accountant report has happened. What happens next? Okay. And ensuring visible consequences for mismanagement. So there must need to be certainly the vast majority of people take these things extremely ethically and very seriously, but the minority of people that may engage into mismanagement and other sort of leakages and corruption, there needs to be very clear consequences. So so in a sense, trust here requires the citizens to see the results and to believe that these results have been happening, or that the lessons have been learned in a clear way. I do not mean this to say that this is only the responsibility or the mandate of the accountants or the Office of Accountant General. I don't mean that in a single bit. I mean that clearly this requires the system to move alongside the political system, the other institutions, and so on and so forth, right? It's clear. But we are where we are. We are sitting together as accountants, as researchers in public sector accounting. So obviously we're taking that position, but it is not clearly a message that it's only down to you to get to this. Okay, I've put some references and some further reading if you want to. This is the best I could do given the time allowed, and obviously there's many angles. I'm looking forward to. I've seen some comments coming in, and I will be happily responding to them. And I'm sure Bruce also and others may wish to add anything at this point. So I will stop there. Bruce, I will end at this point, and obviously invite comments and concerns, feedback. I can be accountable too, of course. Thank you.
Indeed, Prof, you can be accountable too. A very insightful presentation. You've brought quite a lot of thought-provoking issues that would be taking home with. For me, one of the key things, Prof, that you brought out, the issue around the fiduciary trust, which you've challenged us that it is a contractual expectation for managing public funds on behalf of citizens. You then went on to tell us that while citizens contribute through taxes and other fees that they pay to government, to various governments, they don't see the visibility of where the money is going. They don't see the benefits. You then highlight a key point, and which also I think aligns with part of our finding. We just recently did an institutional assessment where we established that there are quite a number of PFM reforms that are going around across Africa. But what is coming out is that these reforms are not really resulting in tangible benefits that can be felt at the grassroots by the citizens. Then you pose a very important question, Prof, where you say the focus mainly of PFM reforms is around on the need to improve fiduciary trust, mainly from one angle, and that is the angle of the citizens, as where we look at the citizens as a customer, as a taxpayer. And I think you asked two vexing questions, Prof. What does this mean for the mutual and the social trust? I think for me, that's a very important point. Then you also raised, does this translate into improved citizens' trust or perceived government importance? Now, with that, Prof, I think it also takes me back to the report that you did on positioning the role of the Accountant General as a strategic advisor, as a key institution in the PFM cycle, where you've highlighted challenges around citizens' trust in the office of the not necessarily the office of the Accountant General, but public sector accountants generally. You've told us that the public do not tend to trust public accountants, and therein raises the issue from the 5 guiding principles that you brought out in resolving some of the issues that you uncovered in the research on how we can reposition the role of the accountant general. Prof, I just want you to bring up to speed and maybe see how then do we position. Yes, you've touched a very important point from the Auditor General's perspective, where the audit reports are produced and flashed, and then what role can we bring in as public accountants so that citizens are able to follow through where the money is going in, where the money is coming from, and the like. And I want you, Prof, I'll take you to guiding principle number 3, where you write, research evidence shows that citizens and communities are not often privy to the role and functions of the Office of the Accountant General and to the motivations for PFM reform, even when the latter paradoxically about improving public accountability and transparency. Much instead is predicted on formal lines of accountability via elected officials. You cite members of parliament, public accounts committee, etc., and pressure from a few civil society actors. So you also conclude, Prof, that as a consequence of this situation is limited public trust. So I just want, as we bring in comments from the various participants who are here, how best can we reposition the Office of the Accountant General so that there is visibility in terms of the work that they're doing, that we move away from the back office, then we also create linkages with the citizens where they're able to see visibility in terms of how our governments across the continent raises the money and how that money is spent.
Thank you. Thank you, Bruce. That's certainly a very good summary of what. Let's see if we have any comments. So I think there was a comment about trust and tax compliance, and that's a very good point. But yeah, I think all around the world, not only in Africa, the issue of trust in the public, in the institutions, affects tax compliance. Let me give you an example, just as we're getting. If we see any comments or any hands up, I will happily stop. I did a project with the colleagues I've mentioned in my slides, Philippe Lassou. We did a project on participatory budgeting. I don't know if you know what is participatory budgeting. So where citizens are asked to participate in the budget. In the local government budget, a small amount, where they can decide, deliberate, and whatever. And one of these interesting paradox of this, I mean, we call it a paradox, was that as a result of people participating in the local government deliberations, they were able to decide where some money should be spent on, let's say, a health center or a school or whatever. At some point, in that particular story, the local government then told them, we don't have enough money. Okay, you went through the whole participation process. We thought we were going to have 1 million. Sorry, we only have 500,000, as an example. And then the interesting outcome was that, and that was not expected, is that the people themselves contributed money. Or in some of the cases that we looked at, the people started to say, yes, I've got to pay my taxes. So in other words, through that process of participation, we developed more trust about the system. They were able to understand how, in a very small amount of money, but certainly they were able to understand the local government financial management process. They were able to see, we need this money. What are we going to spend on? What's the process? what are the requirements? What are the procurement requirements? And all of this, they were able to understand the process. And when they understood the process, they trusted the process. And because they trusted the process, now they find, okay, if they need more money, then I'll need to pay my taxes. If they need more money, then I need to donate money. So you can see how within that simple exercise, a very small and simple exercise of embedding citizens into the accounting process, we developed mutual and social trust, right? We develop mutual and social trust. We're not developing fiduciary trust. We're developing mutual and social trust. And when they understand that, then they become more willing to trust the institution. Yeah. So I think that's what I wanted to have as an example.
Thank you very much, Prof. And at this moment, the delegates, unfortunately, our distinguished Accountant General from Tanzania is unable to join us. He's still in Parliament. There was a prompt call for him to attend to business in Parliament. So we'll go straight into discussing the issues that have been raised. And you can either raise your hand, or you can type through the message and we'll be able to read your message. I'm now opening the floor for comments, questions, and clarification on the insights presentation that Prof has made. So, Prof, while we're waiting for questions, there is a comment here. The best approach is to transform accountability into action. As leaders of various institutions and government, let us believing in what we preach, and when it comes to transparency and accountability. What's your take on that, Prof?
Yeah, well, I certainly think I certainly there's no I mean totally agree that obviously leadership in action, preaching preaching and doing it, of course, as institutional leaders in these positions, that's quite important. But again, I think so I don't have any argument about that. I think, but the argument I have is how does public trust develop out of that, right? So how do we ensure, so this is not a criticism of a comment. The comment is very good. What I'm saying is that the notion of public trust is already eroded, right? So the notion of the trust is eroded. In a stable situation, we could say yes, the institutional leaders are putting accountability in action. They are not only just preaching, but they are doing what they are preaching. That's absolutely fine. But I think when we are in a situation where trust in institutions is eroded, is declining, I'm not saying that. Intersi is saying that. So we need to go a step further, right? So we need to be able to engage in a way that develops the trust back, right? So that's probably my answer to this, my reaction to this.
Thank you very much, Prof. By show of hands, if you have a comment, a question, kindly raise your hands, or you can type in the comment section. Participants, if you have a question, kindly raise your hand. Okay, Prof, and I'm sure as we wait for questions and comments, I also picked another issue, Prof. You've raised in the guiding principle, the guiding principle number 2, you've raised a very important point on reading PFM reforms. And as I alluded to, one of the things I think through our gap analysis as well as the institutional capacity assessment that we undertook was that there is a whole lot of PFM reforms that are going on. But the question is it that the continent is facing reform fatigue? You raise a very important point here where you write, the documented experiences from PFM reforms across Africa suggest that there is need for strong internal expertise to implement appropriate frameworks and pathways for PFM reforms. A continued reliance on external and often donor-linked advisors does not enable African accounting institutions to lead, learn from, and evaluate the consequences of this reform. How best can we then, Prof, can we ensure that these reforms are driven internally, these reforms produce the desired results?
Yeah, I thank you for that. Yes, so that was something that from the previous talk where we highlighted the sort of different approaches to reforms. The first attempts was a sort of big bang reforms. just changing everything, not thinking too much about the context in which you're doing. Okay, so let's just remove this and put that. And this has had some very difficult, it's obviously heavily dependent on expertise, and often it's external expertise. Lots of consultants that come in and try to do as many things as possible within a limited amount of time, because obviously consultants are also trying to obviously look at their resources and make some money out of this in a totally natural way, totally legitimate way. So therefore, what happens is you have a sort of intervention that is very significant, and then they leave, and then well, leaving everyone with a bit of reform here and there, piecemeal changes, things that don't work, things that do work, and a sort of cadre of accountants who are a little bit all confused about what happened. So from these learnings, there's been some really good work in about 10 years ago, looking at the types of reforms that you should be doing. There's one called Getting the Basics Right. One is called the platform approach, where you kind of do things in little increments. You build outcome upon outcome. You start one thing and then you move on to another. So all of these sort of examples of, and one was called how do we, one type of reform also in the past, they had very little political support, right? So it was on paper, but very little and active support of these reforms. And so what happened is that these reforms became very technically oriented, but nothing was moving because of political willingness, political will, political agenda was not aligned to this. So maybe because of particular changes in political cycles, or particular issues at the political level, that sort of influence that. So then the next step of reforms was to make sure that reforms do engage and bring in the political leadership, right? And that the political leadership understands the value and the change in these reforms. Why are we doing this? It's not just a matter of just just a few numbers here and there. It's about really changing the approach. So this has really, I think, happened. And then there's also the idea of drivers of change. What would drive a change? What would you need to make this happen? I was reading recently, the World Bank has been thinking a lot more now about what drives change. So you may have the accountability reform. So this is the main item. Let's say, for the sake of the argument, it could be a budget change, IPSAS, or anything. So this is the technique. This is the technique that you want to bring in. But clearly, it needs other things around it to be moved and to have an impact. So you look at this as one factor, but then you look at other things that you need. Do you need the political will? Do you need uplifting of a profession? Do you need to change the scheme of service? Do you need many things? Together brings that change. That's why I think we've never been able to, and very little of it, we've never been able to see very clearly the effectiveness of a reform, because we're just looking at it in its narrow sense. Okay, so that's one point. Sorry, but I'll stop there because I can see some comments coming in. Bruce, do you want to?
Sorry, before we get to the comment, there is a hand there from Water.
Yeah.
Kindly proceed and ask your question.
Thanks for the opportunity. Good day, Prof. Good day, Chair. And well, let me welcome the presentation as it was made. Before I make my comments, let's go to slide 3 of your presentation. And let me ask one question first. On your second bullet, I see you start with fiduciary trust, going to mutual, and then social. Are those in chronological format? And if they are, why so? And what informs that chronology? Then, Okay, yeah, you can engage, Prof, as we continue.
No, if you want to have your second question, and then I'll reply. That's okay. Thank you. So I was just starting to think. Thank you.
Yes, and then still with those three, you tend to include the fourth one, or all three of them could represent public trust.
Correct.
If not, how does social trust differ to public trust?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. I like the engagement. I mean, this is really fascinating. Firstly, to be clear, there are, academia, everyone sits down and think on their computers. So there are many variations of and many concepts of trust, right? Trust is psychological, trust is organizational, trust is fiduciary, legal. You have so many people writing about the notion of trust. And the notion of public trust. One thing I did find very interesting was that public trust was not really well defined, right? So the idea of public trust, the trust in the public trust in institutions, so how does the trust? There's been some studies, for example, about COVID. There was a survey going on at the time of COVID where people were asked, whilst the government was giving all these instructions, do you trust the institution? Do you trust the government? There was actually a survey going on, and there's been a big paper looking at the role of how trust was changing over time with the COVID situation on a daily basis, almost, on a daily basis, because it was such a unique situation. So I do not claim to present this as this is the only way of looking at public trust. So you're right. I should have clarified. To me, public trust, so the trust in the public institution, is a combination of these three things, right? Now, I'm not saying this is the only way to look at it, okay? I'm not saying this is the only way. There could be other elements of trust. But what I could see in my mind is that when we are trying to understand public trust or trust in public financial institutions, and by here I mean, how do I ensure that citizens trust the institution, trust the government and the public finance? I'm thinking these three elements are important, right? So, but I'm sure we can probably go around the houses and probably get some ideas of what else. But so fiduciary trust. So I didn't do it in a sort of chronological, to answer your question. It wasn't meant to be chronological, but it was more to start with the baseline, if you will. So to me, the baseline is the fiduciary trust, because we are all accountants and we operate in a well established notion of us as a steward, right? So this is what makes accountants important actors. We are stewards, right? As you can go back in hundreds of years, thousands of years, and the previous civilizations in Africa, in Egypt, everywhere, you will find someone who's given the stewardship of a kingdom, right? Handles the finances. And there's always that notion of fiduciary trust in there, right? So that this person is handling on behalf of everyone else these finances. And of course, that means those relationships. I can see your hand is up. I don't know whether you want to react to what I'm saying.
Yes, Prof. And with due respect, it is from a position of not creating a dialogue, but having a different perspective.
Sure.
And I'm coming from this angle that social trust supersedes or comes first. Why so? Because before you are an accountant, you come from a societal point or a society or a community. And once it is not the practice of the community to be trustful or honest, that will overflow to even the position of an accountant, because you come from a baseline that is not trustful. The accounting field, to be a practitioner in it, you need to study and then admit it to our profession. History and the current practice has shown us that even with the accountants that qualify, someone or some powers determine.
Mr. Water?
I'm listening, Chair.
Yes, Mr. Water, I request that you kindly put your point first. We've got a couple of questions that are still unanswered in the chat so that we give space to, yes, please wind up your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So let me just put the opposing or different perspective that I believe if society is not acting trustful or honest, an accountant cannot, because the society has determined, as I'm saying, before being an accountant, you come from a community or a society. Thanks, Chair.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm taking your viewpoint. It's absolutely fine. I mean, I didn't mean it in a way. I mean, you could put them perhaps not A, B, and C, but just could put them around a particular circle, and it would work. And they are not necessarily another important point. They are overlapping, right? So in a sense, when we are born into a society, and I get what you're getting, if you're born in a society, you're born in a certain, you have already a sort of form of social trust here that exists. So I take your point, but remembering that I'm looking at a concept that is around public trust, right? So not trust in general, but rather public trust. So I think that's where we might, but I fantastic. I don't think this has in any way, shape, or form. I take that as a comment that makes sense and helps me to clarify what I'm trying to imply here in this case. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
shall we move
on? And Mr. Water, for that contribution. Prof, I've got a couple of questions and comments. Let me just take three so that you respond to them. The first one comes from Dr. Kalugedo. He says, thanks for the good presentation. The issue of public trust play an important role for the fund entrusted by the citizens. The citizens pay tax, hence they need to see if they are properly used for their benefit. The problem comes where expected results are not realized, and what erodes public trust, and that erodes public trust from public officers. The issue of trust needs to be clearly included in PFM and become enforceable. That's one. Then we also have another one from Ali Mohammed Hesi, and he writes, how can public trust in financial management be established in a system where institutions are historically weak, accountability mechanisms are limited? Maybe let's take those two comments and then we move on. There are a couple of other two comments that I would want you to attend to, Prof.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the first one is that's why I think I totally agree with the first point about, that we can see, it's interesting by having this conversation today, we can see how we bring trust in the conversation, right? And see this, because perhaps before, I don't think people think of accounting and accounting standards or whatever and think trust somewhere, but I think it's an important concept here. And whether to make it enforceable is a different matter. Whether you make it enforceable, fiduciary trust has inevitably an element of enforceability, right? So fiduciary trust, because there is sanctions, rewards, schemes, and whatever are within this notion of fiduciary trust. The principal-agent relationship, so there is something there. So it is, but it needs to become enforceable, and that's where the problem is. The mutual and the social trust is really a different matter, but I think in terms of enforceability, fiduciary trust certainly. On the second point, yes, can trust be established in a system where history is always Greek and accountability? Exactly. So this is, in a sense, it brings perhaps back to Walter's point also. How do we, obviously, the institutions the formal institutions are historically weak, you're right. The formal accountability mechanisms may have been limited, you are right. But how can we bring together the elements of the society, so social trust and mutual trust, to try to reinforce it. Okay, so we, as you said, we all live in that society. We have other ways to trust each other. We have we build on. So I think African the community, the notion of community. I'm just using this word in a very open sense, but we've talked about. I mean, the literature is starting. Even the accounting literature, by the way, is talking about Ubuntu. Is talking about other mechanisms of communitarian relationships, trying to reinforce this in our systems. Okay, so of course, technically we need to improve systems, but at the same time we need to leverage some of these other things. We are Office of Accountant General, we are an institution, we have formal relationships, we have formal systems, but we are also Africans, we are also living in this world, we're also citizens in this particular community. How do we then strengthen that level of community relations? That's where the stakeholder element I was talking about comes in. How do we build more bridges with a community so that people can trust us beyond simply the numbers, beyond simply the reports?
Thank you very much, Prof. Prof, we've got a couple of questions also. Salom Munishi from Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, has question one. In many African countries, public financial management frameworks are well designed on paper, but the practical mechanism can ensure real enforcement of accountability beyond compliance reporting. What practical mechanism can ensure real enforcement of accountability beyond compliance reporting? That's question number one. Number two, how can digital public financial management systems and IFMIS platforms be leveraged not just for reporting, but as a real-time accountability tool that can improve citizens' trust? I think I'll take those two questions from Salam.
Yeah, I think bringing the citizens and people more into this, practical mechanisms. So we want to be able to have more understanding of the outcomes of PFM systems. So how does PFM systems actually generating positive outcomes? Right. So it's not just complying. It's not just ticking the box. It's not just about that, but also we can see that these accounting systems reveal the PFM. The PFM systems reveal more information that can be actioned upon, detect waste, detect irregularities. We can see these actions being taken. Right. We can see these actions being taken. We see decisions taken as a result of those particular systems. Okay, we're not seeing enough of it. Doesn't mean it's not happening. It's probably happening, but we don't see enough of it. Right. So I think that would be the practical thing, is to show we have. This is probably the wrong example to use, but the wrong anecdote to use. But in a way, when Elon Musk started the Doge thing at the start of Trump's political leadership, when Trump started Doge, started asking what is going on in the numbers, they were trying, really, to me, the way I interpreted it was like some form of zero-based budgeting. So they were trying to look at the spending going on and thinking, what is the spending for? Can we change the spending? Can we save money? Unfortunately, their initiative just got, obviously was somehow not well thought out, of course. But what I mean is that we need to be questioning much more from the information we are communicating to the various departments. Are they able to use that information to save money some way or other, or to become more efficient? And can we talk about these stories? Can we say that with IPSAS, we've managed to save 50 million X we've managed to save money here. We've managed to identify duplication. I mean, government spending is awfully known for duplication. You know, we've managed to identify duplication and cut costs. If we can say that, then we can see, yes, Ipsos is having an impact. If you see what I mean, you know, that's what I would like to see. On the second point, I totally agree that the future will be much more. I mean, we have many African countries, large populations, you know, that's the first thing, equally very, very distant from each other. And certainly technology has certainly kept people together through mobile phones. And so the basic technology is there, the basic sort of communication and communication technologies are there in one way or another. So obviously not using that would look you know, not a very good idea. So you need to leverage those. And real time, I think, is another good example. You know, so I have recently, just to take a simple example. I recently, I'm organizing a conference. My colleague, who is very well versed in AI, said, you know, we can put all this information in a very special AI. It's very specific AI, a ChatGPT, but really trained for this information. And then everyone can ask it all sorts of questions. And it was liberating, right? Rather than give you 20 pages of lots of tables and documents, put it in there and then just ask a simple question. Who's presenting at this conference? What time are they doing it? Where is it happening? You know, that sort of thing. So I think really to leverage real-time accountability, we need to perhaps use AI in a responsible way, not the sort of things we are hearing about, but rather, for example, how do we put information, accounting information, in the public domain that allows the citizens to interrogate the accounting information, right? So any type of public, obviously public data, not private data, but public data about what is going on. So but would allow a citizen just to type a question like, what did the organization X spend money on salaries last year? Or what amount of travel was done by the people in this organization? Why? You know, these sort of simple question that can use AI to extract the data and communicate that information. So certainly I can see a future for real-time accountability, real-time challenging, and then that information can then be a way to raise questions. You know, well, you said this, but actually the accountability is telling me, the system is telling me something different.
Wonderful, Prof. Prof, there are two questions, and I want to respond to one, and you add on. There's a question that I've seen from Abdifata, also from Somalia. We'll come to that. But there's also a question that is interesting, which I wanted to add on a few issues. And it reads from Tatenda. It reads, how can IPSAS enhance accountability and transparency, considering difficulties in evaluation, recognition, and ownership challenges, as well as absence of records? Now, I've got interest in this question in the sense that recently we did an analysis of our member countries that transitioned from cash basis to accrual. And here is what we found. Firstly, before they transitioned, this country had reported asset approximately at about 708 million. When they transition on their first transition financial statements, the assets, total asset, and this is before they even conclude and become full IPSAS compliant, the assets stood at 15 billion US dollars. Now, from our point of view and in line with this question, what does this mean? We see a situation where previously we were not able to bring on board to reflect the government's ability to deliver services to the people. What are we saying here? With now this new balance sheet showing 50 billion worth of assets, government is in a position firstly to know how many schools, how many hospitals and other public infrastructure that is needed to provide the much needed public service to the citizens. And in this context, we can even do, I think, Prof, earlier on, you challenged us as accountants that we need to translate this financial information in a way that non-accountants like politicians, parliamentarians would be able to notice, would be able to understand. So with these sort of assets, this country then can determine is the 15 billions worth of asset sufficient to provide services to the current generation, then to the next generation. I think that's in answering that question on how IPSAS can announce that. Then I move on to the next. The next part that we looked at was public liabilities, which before transition, they were recording at 671 million. And the moment they transition, the liabilities grew to 13 billion. Now, what does it say? It gives government visibility in terms of how much does it owe for the goods and services that have been delivered. A lot of us here are public sector accountants. At the end of the day, when we've saved, we need to be paid what is due to us. Now, if we are living in a space where there is opaque in terms of the transparency and the amount that is being disclosed, obviously, at the end of the year, the decision makers may not know to what extent we are exposed in terms of liabilities that are going to be paid for pensions and other employee benefit. But with this exposure, then we're able to see next year how many people would we need to pay for such sort of exposure. So I think this is a very important question, Prof. Possibly you can answer some of the other sides of the question that I may not have touched on. But as you answer this question, there's also an important question from Abtafa Osole from the Accountant General's office in Somalia, where she or he asked, how can we rebuild citizens' trust though there is weak control and lack of accountability, and what steps can we need to do to overcome this situation?
Okay, thank you, Bruce, and thank you for your comments on this. I mean, these are very good examples of how accounting, and how you can, leverage on that and communicate it. How do we communicate this? I mean, certainly visibility of numbers, but then how do you translate it in sort of things that are understandable? So understandability is another sort of big thing. Yeah, there was a question you didn't mention, but I thought I'll mention it, was sort of political resistance, and because I think here it's more about obviously making politicians and political leadership understand the liberating value of accounting. So at this point, I think accounting often seen as a sort of counter to a political kind of agenda. But I think it's how we make it, as you're saying, making it more attractive, because the more information, as Bruce has mentioned, the more information we can collect, the more information we can circulate, the better you can make decisions, the more we can communicate our outcomes, the better people will see it was because of your leadership and because of the government's leadership, political leadership, but achieve these particular outcomes, right? And there's no replacing these visible things for a citizen to see the streets being clean, the roads infrastructure perfect, the schools performing very well, and then how they obviously will benefit from that if you've done a good job. So I think I totally agree that we cannot see this as a sort of an antagonistic relationship, accountability and political kind of. We need to try to bring certainly politicians within the space of using and embedding accounting in their own way of thinking, perhaps. Not easy, I certainly agree. But I think it's perhaps going beyond the antagonism, beyond the us versus them kind of argument, and then see how we can find the common ground, really. Cases have shown that, but as I said, political will, and once politicians and political issues understand more clearly the possible benefits, the outcomes from this, they are less likely to engage in resistance. Now, from the case of Somalia is very, I can only sort of imagine that, yeah, I mean, within the context of Somalia, it's how do we build trust? I think this is where even more important to bring the people into activities where we can engage with them around the role of accounting. So I know that accounting often traditionally is a sort of, this is secret, this is confidential, this is public institutions. There's a sort of, obviously, a mindset around accounting and public sector, which is for good reason, but also has the consequence of appearing to be opaque. And whereas I think in a situation exactly where you have weak control is how do we bring citizens here to act, to be part of a process of accountability. Okay, so in practical terms, that's what I'm saying. In practical terms, in local government in particular, there's been many experiments to involve people, groups of citizens, communities into doing parts of the budgets and being part of the development process and being part of this, because we want the people to be involved. And as they become more involved, then they can also participate in accountability. They can also participate in control. So rather than seeing simply accounting as a sort of, of course, it's a technical, has its processes, its control systems and everything else. But then how do we bring the population, especially when I totally agree, when the situation is institutionally is very weak. And so the more you bring people in, I think the better. May not be easy to do at central government level. That's not my suggestion. It's much more at local government level. It works very well. What do I mean by perceived corruption? Okay, right. Firstly, there's actual corruption and perceived corruption. So firstly, actual corruption is obviously cases that have been found proven, right? So you have a case, it takes a few years, it goes to court, and then an actual corruption case happens. And I certainly agree it has an impact if it involves particularly particular individuals and so on and so forth. So this may paradoxically, if there is actually actual corruption cases that are taken very seriously, people get consequences, and this is very visible. Actually, it does perhaps improve public trust, because as we are taking action against actual corruption cases in a consistent and rational way, then people might perceive, yeah, there is corruption, but action is being taken. So actually public trust could go up. Perceived corruption is basically more, and that's what feeds into many indicators all around the world, is indicators of what people perceive is happening. And that's probably because of sometimes the lack of information, the lack of accounting information, the opacity of communication of information. And so people develop notions, perceptions of what is going on because there's no other information. Okay, so information asymmetry, or the lack of information, leads to all sorts of possibilities, all sorts of perceptions that something else is going on. This is natural, this is human, and so therefore that does impact on public trust negatively. So it's not that proven cases only, but it's also perceptions of what may be happening, and often aided by other sort of agenda that may influence that. And that's why you have surveys of corruption, various surveys that try to understand people's view of perception of corruption, maybe from their daily experiences, but that are not proven legally speaking. Then trust grows when public institutions are independent enough. I agree. I don't think I've seen the comments here. Trust grows when public institutions are independent enough to act professionally, but accountable enough to remain transparent and responsible to the public. I totally agree. And that brings to me how we should see, and taking again Walter's conversation before, is the sort of feed-in element of these three elements of fiduciary, social, and social and mutual. So in a sense, they feed on each other. In a sense, as we have a clear understanding of fiduciary trust, clear appreciation of fiduciary trust, and clear understanding of mutual trust, it then feeds into better social trust, and so on and so forth. So it's a sort of virtual circle, if you want, that develops. So it's not at a point in time, probably as I see your comment, but it more as a sort of recursive, keeps going on as goes along. Right, if we're building at home, the grassroots communities are not experiencing positive impact of the experience of AAG economically because the body of accountants tracks in dollars when example. Okay, so I suppose one of the challenges is always how does the grassroots communities understand the role of accounting and accounting organizations. And to be fair, I think that comment could be made of any sort of accounting profession around the world. All around the world, accounting professions, sometimes we use the term public interest. I'm sure you must have come across this idea of public interest. And they struggle into, this is always a claim, we are operating in the public interest. But it's very, very hard, even for non-public accountants, like private professional bodies, to actually explain what it means. Or actually what does it mean in public interest? So it's to be fair, it's a wider problem that we have.
Thank you very much, Prof. And I think we're at the dot, but there's a very important question that has been asked by Mr. Walter Molekelwa, and he brings in this important aspect. If we bring it home, the grassroots communities, Africans, are not experiencing a positive impact of the existence of AAAG economically, because this body of accountants transact in dollars while it exclusively exists in Africa, 21 countries. And as of today, Mr. Walter, we are at 24 countries. And this is a very important point that you've raised. But suffice to say, Mr. Walter, that we find ourselves in a sort of dilemma. We would have loved to transact in shilling, pula, kwacha, rand, or naira. But the question and dilemma, the hard place we find ourselves in as AAAG is whether our local currencies, our African currencies are tradable. For instance, if I have naira, would I be able to freely walk through the borders of Botswana and pay in naira? I think that's a sort of challenge that we find ourselves in. It's a matter that possibly can be engaged at a higher level, possibly at a continental level, at the AU, like the way they've done in the EU, where you can move with one currency from border to border. But in terms of economic benefits, definitely, Mr. Walter, there is more to benefit, and we sincerely apologize that as at now, we cannot meet this requirement of where our members, the citizens of Africa, are able to pay in their local currency due to the way the structure of our continent's economy is structured. That, like I indicated, it's not possible that I can come here in Lusaka with a kwacha, and possibly if you're based in South Africa or whichever country you're based in, that I would be able to pay through that. Even in terms of exchange, you'd find unless there's close linkages between trade and economies between two countries, you find the exchange of currencies would be very difficult. But in terms of the benefits, definitely we come with a lot of benefits. We're working around developing knowledge products. Visit our websites where we're developing some of the toolkits that we're discussing around here. here that members can be able to plug in and adapt to their situation. We are facilitating and encouraging peer-to-peer. Just last year, we oversaw over 13 countries that went to learn and exchange ideas with different countries. We are producing knowledge products that member countries would be able to look at and interpret. Right now, we're driving the reform agenda around the standard setting. You may be aware that the IPSAS, International Public Sector Accounting Standards, are currently not in Portuguese language. So we're engaging at a global level with the IPSAS B to ensure that IPSAS is translated into Portuguese. So there are quite a lot that we're doing, and within the short space that we've been in existence, definitely there is more that needs to be done, but we on the ground, research is part of the issue that we are taking, and hence the coming in of Prof to share some of the ideas that we've discussed here. But ultimately, I think we appreciate your concern. It's very valid, but unfortunately, as of now, it's a dilemma that we're in until we have a shift at a continental level. Possibly we can have that conversation where all AAAG transaction should be able to be undertaken in a prescribed currency that will be done at continental level. With that, I think we should come to the end of this conversation.
Bruce?
Important, yes, Prof.
Yeah, I know. Sorry, I just wanted to, before you conclude, I just wanted to make an appeal. I know there's many people here, and that I think I just wanted to make a general point that we want to do more research. Obviously, we're working with AAAG. We will have soon projects. I don't want to give the details, but we will soon have projects where we would need the support of various OAGs with the research, maybe surveys or things like this. I think I just wanted to highlight that this is some of the things I've mentioned, some of the things that have been discussed need further discussion, further investigation at the local level, right? And every OAG is at a different point. I mean, I've seen the case of Somalia. It's very different from the case of Ghana. It's very, very different from the case of Zambia. So everyone is grappling with these ideas of accountability, public trust, and all of this in a different way, in PFM in a very different way. And so at some point we certainly myself and others in the team would certainly want to engage and look at more specific research questions and topics. So that's just an appeal from my side, Bruce, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wonderful insights. But in closing, and I want to thank you, Prof, for the wonderful insights that you've brought, the conversations that you've triggered, and also the active participation of our participants. We thank you very much for taking your time to be here with us. We at AAAG working around the clock to ensure that we provide such forums through webinars, through workshops and conferences. Please be on the lookout. We'll be holding monthly webinars every last Friday of the month. Thank you very much, and it's a good evening, it's a good morning, the good afternoon from wherever you've joined us from. We really appreciate your presence. Good day.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone.
Bye-bye, Prof.
Bye-bye.